Awesome. Well, good morning, One Hope. A lot of you know me. I'm Megan Churness, and I grew up at One Hope. But since yeah, yeah, and since I graduated a couple years ago from Western, I've been one of One Hope's sent missionaries, and I'm currently serving on a college campus up in Mount Vernon, Washington. But I'll share a little bit more about that later. Before we dive into our passage today, I want to kind of set us up. Oh, wait, I forgot to click. That's a big thing. So this is our passage, and kind of what we're going to be talking about is what we can learn about Paul and how he explains the gospel to people. And so kind of to give us a framework for today, we're going to kind of talk about 5 stages or 5 strategies that we can take from Paul as we sit in this scripture. So I think some kind of 4 key things. There's one is a 2-parter. One is to know people, be known, contextualize the gospel, and the gospel made personal. So, but before we even get to the passage that John shared for us, I want to kind of give us some background for what's been happening. So right before verse 16, we see that Paul, he's still doing his thing. He's going all around, that part of the world. And he's been traveling with Silas. And at one point, he meets up with Timothy, one of the other guys that he's working with. And they've been in Berea, which we talked about last week. But there was some drama, and people came in and from Thessalonica, and they're like, this is crazy, ma. That's actually word for word from the Bible, for sure. But yeah, so it gets to a point where they're like, okay, Paul, you need to go ahead, and you go and wait for us in Athens. So Paul is by himself in Athens, and that's kind of where our story picks up. So we see that Paul is on his own, but he doesn't take this as a pit stop or just a waiting period. Paul knows the Great Commission that Jesus said in Matthew 18, where he said, therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And some translations have understood that verb go to mean in your going or as you are going. And so that's kind of the framework we can learn from Paul, that as we're going or in our going, we're to be making disciples and preaching the gospel. So Paul he's going to take every opportunity to do just that. So in verse 16, we see that while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well in the marketplace day by day, those who happened to be there. So Paul's first action in Athens is to get to know Athens. And the word see that we see in verse 16 is where we get the word theater from. And the Greek is theoro, I don't know how to say it, but it means to view attentively, to take a view of, to survey. He's not just glancing around, he's taking the city in, he's learning, he's getting to know people. And this takes us to the first strategy that we can learn from Paul: know people. Part of knowing people is going to their spaces. Paul, his strategy is always to go to the synagogue first. He is a Jewish man, and so he can understand Jewish people the best and first. So that's what he does. He first goes to the synagogue, and he talks about Jesus. And often they don't really like it. And so he doesn't just go to the synagogue. And it says that he went to the marketplace every day. We don't know how many days Paul was there, but the text kind of seems like he's been there for a little bit. And so that, I think it's fair to say that he probably interacted with a lot of the same people. And so he got to know people, and people got to know him. And we see in verse 18 that a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, what is this babbler trying to say? Others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Yeah, so this part is so interesting because this is probably where he's in the marketplace, because we're seeing some Gentile people who are interacting with him. And we'll talk a little bit about Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, but they were really into just new stuff. They were interested in hearing what people had to say. So when they're talking with Paul, it's not necessarily that they agree with what he's saying about Jesus and the resurrection, but they're curious. They're like, something is different. We don't really know what, but that's interesting. So we can see in verse 19, then they took him and brought him to a meeting place of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know this new teaching that you are presenting. You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean." Yeah, I kind of want to give us a little background for the Areopagus, or however you say it, we don't know. But it's the Greek word for Mars Hill, which maybe some of us are more familiar with that word. There's like a church and all that. But it's like Mars is like the Greek god of war, or like Ares. So it's like a meeting place for ideas, but also it's a place of worship. We'll see later Paul interacts with people. And so it's a meeting place, and there are philosophers all around discussing different ideas. And this is after like the height of Greek philosophy, right? We're in the Roman Empire now. But people are still discussing ideas. They still care about talking. It even says that in the passage a little bit later. Yeah. So I think that brings us kind of to our next point that'll kind of draw us into the rest of the passage. But when sharing the good news, we want to be like Paul and be known. And what I mean by that is that Paul was at least approachable enough for strangers to invite them to their place of worship and philosophical discussion. Paul was going and having conversations with people in the marketplace, in the synagogue, and building relationships with people. He's getting to know them, and they're getting to know Paul. And I think that's like a key for us to take in mind, that evangelism or outreach is relational. And we can know that because the church is meant to be relational. And the church can't be relational and ready for discipleship if evangelism doesn't start from a relational place. And so I think we can learn that from Paul, that in order for places to grow and for discussion to happen, we have to be talking with people. So he starts them off that way. Okay, so I'm going to move on to what Paul is actually saying. Okay, so Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and carefully looked at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. And that is what I'm going to proclaim to you." This kind of takes me to kind of the meat and potatoes of what we'll be talking about today. And that's that idea of contextualizing the gospel. And I think that's something that Paul does really beautifully, and something that can feel intimidating when we read Paul. Because that's kind of a long passage. Paul is a talker. He will just talk, but there's so many hidden gems in what he is saying, and we're going to talk about that. Yeah, so he first says, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious." So right off the bat, we see that Paul is acknowledging the people that he's around. And in order to do that, he has to be observing them. As it says, as he walked around, he saw so many idols, and he saw that there was an inscription to an unknown God. So Paul is taking in not just Athens as a whole, the city, but in the specific place that he is, he's able to look around and see what people are caring about. What are people talking about? How in this whole city that they really care about knowing what's out there, what's real and what's not real, and discussing all those things. Some scholars have said that there was about 30,000 idols in Athens around this time, which is kind of a lot. There's a lot of people trying to figure out what to worship and how to worship. And Paul picks up on this to the point where he can notice, oh, I see something unique about their kind of worship. When he notices the inscription "To the unknown God," Paul can think, this might be my in to the sharing the gospel, as he's praying and thinking about going around. Because contextualizing the gospel means to place it in context. That makes sense. But that doesn't mean we change the gospel, and we don't see Paul doing that either. Because there's real truth and freedom in the gospel, and Paul knows this, and we are too. But when we're bringing the gospel, people are coming from all sorts of places. They have different habits, they have different memories, they're living in a specific time and place. The way that I received the good news when I was about 4 years old, through a very kind conversation with my parents, is very different than how the Apostle Paul needed to receive the good news. one of us, I'll let you guess, one of us had to have our worldview completely shattered and our plans for serving God altered, and entirely being thrown off a horse and being blinded while Jesus appearing to us. And one other of us had a very sweet and calm conversation with their dad, followed by a simple prayer of turning to Jesus. You can probably guess who's who. Because I realized that the way that I received the gospel as a small child in the Midwest might differ from how I might receive the gospel if I started following Jesus now as an adult in the PNW. I figured the same would be true for my dad. And, he always picks on us kids, especially when we were growing up. So I figured it'd be fun to put him in my sermon. But I think it would make sense that if I were to explain the gospel to my 50-something-year-old dad, if he wasn't following Jesus right now, I might explain the gospel to him differently than if I were talking to his early 20s self. At each of their points in time, stages of life, even where they lived and who they were influenced by, they might hear the gospel differently from one another. Maybe not too differently, though, because they both have the same taste in shirts. But, in all seriousness, though, if my dad now and his younger self would even hear the gospel at least a little differently from one another, how much more would the Athenians need to hear the gospel from Paul, who was a Jew and very different from them? I'm going to go back into Paul's sermon. In verse 24, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples built by human hands, and is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or any image made by human design or skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof to this to everyone by raising him from the dead. So this takes us to contextualizing the gospel part 2. And like we were talking about earlier, Paul is just a master of this. And I want to take us back to the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers that he was interacting with before. I was trying to I didn't know what Epicurean philosophers believed, and I had heard the word Stoic before, but I didn't know what that meant either. But Epicurean philosophers were people who studied under Epicurus, who was a Greek philosopher. And he believed that the goal of all of human life was happiness. He thought, no stress. That was kind of his thing. He was like, we need to get rid of, physical pain and mental pain. And to do that, we, eliminate our fear and anxiety. He also didn't believe in an afterlife. He thought that this was kind of all there was. He maybe believed in some sort of gods or higher power, but he didn't believe that they cared about us. He was like, they kind of set stuff up, but we don't really interact with them now. And Stoic philosophers did believe that they were somehow connected to the divine, beings, they didn't really specify that, but we're to live in nature and to reason with one another. So we see people that are trying to figure out life and trying to figure out what they believe. And we see Paul enter into that, and at the same time that he is explaining the truth of the gospel and shifting their worldview, he is also paying them such high respects for understanding what they're trying to learn and for seeking real truth. So we see when Paul is saying, that we are God's offspring. And he's quoting their poets and philosophers. The poet that he's referring to is Aratus. I think some other people may have also framed that word of humans are part of God or the divine's offspring, that we're connected in that way. But Paul knows them. Like, he is living in that day and that time, and so he knows what people are talking about. Or he's been in the marketplace all this time, and he's heard people use this language, and he sees another in for the gospel, so he can explain. But he goes on to say that being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone. So Paul is using his example of, if God made us and we're human, then God must be like us. Not to say that God is human, but he's creating a space for these philosophers who thought that God or the gods of the divine were so high above us, we're so far away and not close at all, that Paul is saying, no, our God is a personal God. Like, he comes to us. Like, he draws people to us. He doesn't live in temples or stone or rocks. Like, he has made us for himself. So Paul is trying to shift things that they would have believed in their worldview, but in a way that is trying to be kind and respecting their poets, which I think is something that we can all learn to do. I think it feels like a scary part of contextualizing the gospel, of making that feel applicable to people. It could feel like we're like cheapening the gospel in some way, but we can see that Paul only strengthens the gospel in this way because it's making sense to them, right? If the gospel doesn't make sense to someone, then it doesn't do any good to them to tell them the gospel. So it might not be enough for us to say, Jesus died on the cross for your sins, if no one knows what that means or why that's important for us. But Paul sees that importance. He talks about Jesus and the resurrection because he knows that those are connecting points for people. If people don't believe that there's an afterlife, for him to say, the resurrection is real, and let me explain it to you, it's like a new idea and a new thought that he can speak into. Yeah. So we have to be like Paul, and we have to contextualize the gospel for those around us and for ourselves, too. Yeah. I'm going to take a pause here and kind of shift and share about the ministry that I serve with. I don't think I said at the beginning, but I work for a campus ministry called Chi Alpha, or Campus Christian Fellowship. And I'd like to share a little bit about what our ministry does and what I do with our ministry, and then we'll come back to our passage at the end. So I graduated a couple years ago, and I've been a missionary with Campus Christian Fellowship since. And in our ministry, a lot of what we do is outreach and discipleship. Those are like the bare bones of what we do. And what that looks like is we have weekly services on campus colleges. Every week, most days of the week, there's something happening on campus, whether it's a small group meeting or a large group meeting, or one-on-one discipleship is happening throughout campus. And that's how my faith was really strengthened in college. Like, I'm really grateful for the way that One Hope has like poured into me, but my faith really took off in college. Like, that was just, it's different when you're around people who are your age, who are seeking God, and they don't have to come to church because they live at their parents' house. Like, I don't know, maybe some of you can connect with that feeling, but it becomes your own. And so that was true for me too. And being met in campus ministry, the Lord showed me just, this is like where so many lost are. This is where people who are searching, who, like the Areopagus, are making big philosophical discussions and figuring out what they believe about themselves, about the world, about God. So it was a place that we can reach people. And there's 4 different kinds of people that we reach on our campus. There are those who are coming to college who already have a faith in Jesus, but need to continue discipleship like we all do. So they're continuing living their life for Jesus. The second kind of person is someone who maybe came from a Christian background, but isn't sure what they believe and is maybe deciding to not follow Jesus. And we're able to create a space and community for people to ask their questions and to share their doubts. And then we also reach out to people who don't know Jesus at all, maybe never grew up knowing him or just aren't interested, but they're interested in community. They're interested in friendship. And so that's what we provide. We provide a space for people to meet and gather. And the other kind of person that we reach out to is international students. that's a big part of our ministry is welcoming international students. Often the case is that when an international student comes to the U.S., it's hard for them to make friends and to meet people and build community. And so we're able to do that for people and to, through relationship, share about our faith and get to know theirs. But there's like a saying in campus ministry that campus ministry gets to do world missions in reverse, where people from the nations are coming to the U.S., where I couldn't go to 80 different countries in my lifetime probably and have deep, meaningful relationships with people and share the gospel with people who might not have access to it. But 80 international students from different countries can come to my campus, and I can talk about Jesus with them and become their friend. And then they can go back to their home country with the gospel. So it's a really unique space, and where people are coming from all over and from different places in life, but are questioning and figuring out what they think. So it's a really cool space, but I wanted to share about my current assignment is at Skagit Valley College in Mount Vernon. So these past 2 years, I've been a missionary at Western Washington University, which is my alma mater, and several of your alma maters, I know. Go Bikes. But during this past year, I really felt called to college students that are at the community college level. Community college is often an oxymoron. There's usually no community happening. And so I saw that there was a need. There's a very small missionary team who's currently there, and they've been needing more people to help serve them. Their community has been growing. That was the picture I showed before. That's their current population of like the students who are in their ministry. And their women's ministry is growing quite a lot. So me and another gal are going to join their team. So it'll be a total of 4 people witnessing on this campus. And we're often, I think currently we're the only Christian club on the campus. There's some other ministries that are reaching out to students, which is awesome, but we're the only ones that kind of have an easy in to talking with students. We get to be club advisors. That's how we're able to be on campus. So it's about 20 minutes south of Bellingham, so it's very close, but there's a great need, and there's a lot of different students in life. And if you know anything about community college, there's a lot of lost people and people who are figuring out what they think and what they believe, and needing good community. I wanted to share briefly about how I'm able to be on campus, how that happens. So like many world missionaries, campus missionaries in Chi Alpha raise their budget for their year to work full-time with students. And this is possible through, the monthly and annual giving of churches and partnerships with families and individuals. I'll be heading back to Bellingham this week. We'll have some retreats with our students before the school year starts, so we're really excited. And I'm about 80% raised on my budget. So I would love for you to be praying about God raising my budget. I'm going on faith that he will. I'm going to be putting in the work still when I'm gone. But really excited to start on campus. I'm really excited about outreach, you guys. It's going to be so good. And if you know me and have talked about me, sometimes outreach could be the most, and maybe you felt this, but outreach can feel very daunting and feel very big and feel, how do I share the gospel with someone? And, the sermon has been very helpful for me in getting excited and thinking about all of that and what it looks to contextualize the gospel for community college students. Anyway, that was a side note. That wasn't in my notes. Please pray. And I'm going to pass out some prayer cards, but then I'd love to share about my friend Natalia. So the prayer cards I'm passing out have my name and the campus that I'll be serving at, and it has different ways that you can be praying for me. So it has different prayer points and things like that. But on the back, you can also use it to connect to my newsletter. And so I give out a monthly email newsletter that you can receive. So there's a way to sign up for that, but you can also come talk to me and I can write down your email. But I'm going to pass it down. The awkward pause, so funny. But okay, that's enough of the logistics of my ministry. I want to talk about Natalia. So Natalia is an international student currently at Skagit Valley College, and she's from Colombia. I've gotten to know her this past year because during this past year, as I was discerning where God might be calling me, I was able to visit Skagit Valley College CCF meetings. And Natalia is a nursing major, and she came to Washington as a nominal Catholic. So she didn't really know Jesus, but she had kind of like a faith background. And kind of the story that I want to share about her connects to our passage, because I was really excited that it was Acts 17, because that's a passage that we use in our ministry quite a lot. We do this thing called an Acts 17 walk. And so what we do is, this is when we're teaching our student leaders, what does it look like to prayer walk on a campus? What does it look like to do what's called conversational evangelism, where you go up to someone and you start to have a conversation about faith with them. So what we have them do is, first, they like go off in pairs of 2 or 3 or whatever, and they go and just look around the campus. They examine it just how Paul did in Athens. They try to, if they ask someone a question, they're just asking a question to get to know the campus and the culture, and to figure out, what does the campus care about? What are the values? Where do people meet? Do people meet? Do they meet in groups? Do they sit by themselves? Are they eating their lunch on campus, or are they heading to their car right after class? Figuring out all those things. And then we have them go back around and walk around the campus and ask people questions. And the hope is to have a conversation about spirituality with them. And so often we try not to bait and switch anyone. So often our students will ask, me and my friend are walking around trying to get to know campus. Would it be okay if we asked you a couple questions about spirituality? So it gives them an in or an out if they want. But then they, from there, can have a conversation about faith and build a friendship. And the reason I share that is because Will, one of our campus missionaries at Skagit, a couple years ago, he was walking around campus doing the same thing, doing an Acts 17 walk, and he found himself in the international student office. And he was walking around, and he saw this gal who was by herself, and he just started chatting with her, and they built a conversation and a friendship, and he invited her to one of our meetings on Tuesday nights. And she was like, okay, sure. I haven't met any friends, and I'd love to. I'll skip a lot of like her story, because it's a lot of back and forth of learning who Jesus is and getting to know him in a real way and in community. But a couple years ago, she got baptized and was our club like president for the year. And so one conversation really does a lot, which I think is very key for us to know. But yeah, so Natalia is awesome. She's so cool, and she's still one of our student officers this year. So really excited to walk with her. And she's so open about sharing her testimony of what God has been doing in her life and what he's been doing in her mom's life now, which is just so beautiful. But yeah, and college ministry is just a great place to have those kind of conversations. So really excited to go back. And the way that Natalia heard the gospel was through so much community, and community with people her age, kind of in her same stage of life, figuring out what she believed, because people are seeking truth, and then it became real to her. And the truth of the gospel doesn't change, but we do, and we change, and we have different thoughts, and we don't know how to receive things always. But we can learn to share the gospel differently so that people all receive it. We're going to continue in our passage and see how people respond to Paul's sermon. All right, in verse 32, when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris. Damaris isn't here, but what a testament that this Damaris is likely who our Damaris is named after. And that's only happened because Paul took advantage of where he was at and where God placed him. And a number of others. And this takes us to our last stage in missions briefly, the gospel made personal. I think it's important that the author of Acts, Luke, writes the names of the people who started following. You could have just said, and some people believed, yay. But I think it's important for us to know that specific people said yes to Jesus. Specific people were named and have created legacies of Jesus followers. And I think kind of as we end, I want us to all be thinking of at least one name that comes to mind when we think of someone who doesn't know the gospel or maybe doesn't understand the gospel, but who we can be praying about and who we can be thinking about, how can I contextualize the gospel for where they're at and what they believe? Not everyone will accept the gospel, and Jesus knows this, so it's not on us for people to accept, but it is on us to make it understandable. Yeah. And I think as we head into communion, I think that will be a key thing for us too. To make the gospel understandable, we have to first understand it. And I think by doing that is through reminding ourselves of the gospel, and we do that in communion. So I'm going to invite the worship team to come back up.